So our next presenter today is Caprielle Larsen with Paragon. Um, so Caprielle, or Capri Larsen, is a project scientist with Paragon Professional Services. She has over 12 years of experience as an environmental chemist and data manager for consulting firms, supporting DoD projects through QAP development, data validation, and data usability assessment. Capri began her career as a data validator, performing all stages of validation on diverse matrices for traditional and emerging contaminants. She was a designated subject matter expert in data validation while employed as a senior chemist at AMEC Foster Wheeler. Capri was the first project chemist at CTI and Associates, and she established their data group of skilled chemists and data managers. Capri has a bachelor's degree in chemistry from Willamette University, and she is passionate about supporting analytical projects via the implementation of robust QA and QC programs. So with that, I will turn it over to Capri.
All right, thank you so much. Hopefully everyone can see my slides now. It took a second to load, so it was great to have a little bit of extra time. Okay, I've cut my camera. We should have enough bandwidth. All right, so today I'm here to talk about how we can balance professional judgment with written validation guidelines. But more specifically, what happens when there are sorry, someone laughing at Willamette. What happens when there are data qualification schemes in the data validation guidelines that don't seem like a good fit for our project? So I'm going to say the maybe controversial thing out loud and upfront. Sorry. Many in the validation community routinely deviate from several of the qualification schemes in the DoD guidelines based on professional judgment. I'm really not here to advocate for deviations or judge them, but they're happening, and there's a reason, sometimes maybe a good reason. But there's also a lot of inconsistency in whether, how, when, and where deviations are documented. So I want to talk about really all of that. Okay, it's a tricky subject. So the goals of this presentation are to start with data quality indicators. We're going to define data quality indicators and their role in project planning and data validation. DQIs are going to feature heavily in this. We're going to establish what I feel are some key considerations for using professional judgment to evaluate data qualification schemes in the context of those DQIs and project-specific criteria, and then address when and how to document planned deviations to the DoD data validation guidelines. I'm going to lean heavily on that word plan today. Carefully documenting deviations during the planning stages can save a lot of time and create a more defensible data set. So I'll be advocating for that pretty heavily. All right. One thing I didn't mention on the previous slide. So when I talk about project planning, I'm going to be referring to UFP QAPs. And I want to acknowledge up front, there are other formats of QAPs and SAPs. The Navy SAP is particularly important, right? But within this presentation, when you see a reference to a worksheet, it is mapped to the optimized UFP QAP worksheets. So speaking of references, these are the references associated with terms, definitions, and processes used in this presentation. So we start with the Uniform Federal Policy for Quality Assurance Project Plans, which is a three-part policy document from the IDQTF. Part 1 is the UFP QAP manual, finalized in 2005. I'm going to reference that. Part 2A are the optimized UFP QAP worksheets. The original worksheets were, of course, released in 2005, then later revised, recombined, and finalized as the optimized worksheets in 2012. Part 2B is from 2005, like Part 1. It is the Quality Assurance / Quality Control Compendium of Minimum QA/QC Activities. But we don't have all day, so I'm going to call it the QA/QC Compendium in this presentation. I think people tend to forget about Part 2B, maybe because the minimum requirements weren't really universally adopted. But what I like about it for our purposes today is that it has a lot of interesting systems-focused discussion and in-depth analysis of DQIs. All the remaining references are the DoD data validation guidelines. When I was putting this presentation together, I considered all of the current available modules except Module 3, because most of our projects have moved away from that by now. All right, our agenda. We're going to talk about the data quality indicators. We're going to define them. We're going to discuss their role in project planning. We're going to establish the relationship between DQIs and various types of QC measurements and DQIs and data validation. Then we'll talk about how we can evaluate qualification schemes in the validation guidelines. We'll explore relationships between DQIs and qualification schemes, specify some key considerations for evaluating those schemes using our professional judgment, and examine qualification schemes, some examples, that might not align with many project DQOs. Finally, I'll talk about some ways to document deviations from the DoD data validation guidelines during project planning and during data validation. I will also touch on what we can do if we've waited until the DUA, but mostly to just encourage everyone to be more proactive than that. You should know that when I use the word deviation, I am using the language that is in the data validation guidelines. I will argue that if we plan ahead enough, we can actually avoid like a QAP deviation by being very proactive. All right, foundational concepts. So what are DQIs? How do they relate to project planning? Data quality indicators are, of course, abbreviated DQIs. Many of us know them as the PARCS parameters, which we'll talk about very briefly on the next slide. But more broadly, they are indicators, they are elements or parameters that are used to characterize the quality of data. And that's a definition from the QA/QC compendium. As a concept, DQIs are just characteristics of measurement. They're used in a lot of different industries when we talk about quality. And they are used, of course, to consider data. So when we're assessing data quality, DQIs are the conceptual categories that those assessments fit into. So then how do they broadly fit into the project planning process? I'm going to say that 3 times fast. All right, so during QAP development, DQIs unite programmatically required QC measurements with our project-specific data quality objectives via our measurement performance criteria. So they're this bridge between our DQOs, MPCs, and our QC measurements. And hopefully that will be more than just alphabet soup by the time we're done today. More specifically, when we're developing a QAP, we, usually the chemists, specify the types of QC measurements that will be associated with our analytical data. Most of these are programmatically defined, so they come from the QSM and the analytical methods. In this context, QC measurement means both QC samples, like blanks, spikes, duplicates, but also things like calibration requirements and laboratory sensitivity. So these are primarily documented in UFP QAP Worksheet 15, that's sensitivity, 20, the field QC, which that's not programmatically defined, 19 and 30, preservation and holding times, 24, calibration, and 28, which is our classic batch QC. So then I'm going to move backwards a little bit. When we're in worksheet 28, we're recording the QC samples for each matrix, analytical group, and method, again, from the QSM and the analytical method. We need to know what the DQIs are for each of these, and that's going to help us prepare worksheet 12. If we're performing stage 2B validation or higher, we should also be working out the DQIs for everything we've listed in worksheet 24. All right, so then in worksheet 12, we actually start with the DQIs. Traditionally, the focus was precision and accuracy, but increasingly as a contractor, I'm being asked to include all PARCS parameters, which is fine, good, and great. And for each of those, we assign one or more QC sample or measurement. And then those usually come from worksheet 28, maybe 24 as well, which is why we needed to know our DQIs. And then we set project-specific criteria, MPCs, measurement performance criteria for each. So that's how we are fitting the DQIs into the project planning process. All right, real quick, what are those DQIs? So the DQIs used in environmental project quality are precision, accuracy, representativeness, completeness, comparability, and sensitivity. Most of us know that. The first letter of the DQI spells out parks, so we all just call these the parks parameters. And if anyone's not well acquainted with these, there are brief definitions provided on this slide, and there's a lot more great information about these parameters in the QA/QC compendium. So as we move forward, it's important to note that precision and accuracy are the primary DQIs associated with QC sample selection and evaluation for definitive data. And I think that's section 2.1 of the QA/QC compendium. But that means they are also the primary DQIs assessed during data validation. They're not the entirety of the picture, but it's a huge focus, right? And so they're going to be our focus today. So let's talk about which of the DQIs are related to which QC measurements or samples. This is important because the DQIs that are assigned to QC measurements during project planning kind of dictate how we conceptualize data limitations when we're faced with QC exceedances later down the road, like during validation. So how do we know which DQI is associated with each of the bajillion QC samples out there? There are two good places to start looking for this info if you're a little lost, and they are Table 6 of the UFP QAP Manual and Appendix A of the QA/QC Compendium, although those documents are 21 years old, and they really don't capture some of the newer QC sample types. So here we're going to talk more generally. Let's say your QC sample's not on there. So for precision, we examine repeat measurements, field duplicate, MS with MSD, LCS with LCSD, matrix duplicate, etc. For accuracy, we think of it as having two subtypes, or at least that's what all of the QAP manual and everything else tells us. So we've got accuracy/bias, which is assessed through the evaluation of spikes. Not necessarily true spikes, but we'll get into that. So it's LCS, MS, even CCVs, PDSs, right? For accuracy/contamination or contamination/bias, we're assessing the evaluation of blanks, both field originating and laboratory blanks. There are so many. The data validators in the house, AO, will be extremely familiar with all the QC samples named on this slide, and I would argue that's because the evaluation of QC measurements associated with precision and accuracy is a major focus of data validation. All right, so how are DQIs and data validation related beyond that sentence I said at the last slide? So from a process standpoint, when we validate data, we're evaluating the performance of a required QC sample against the project-specific criteria, which are our measurement performance criteria, like from QAP Worksheet 12 and 28. We then assign qualifiers to sample results based on quality limitations, and those are indicated by the associated DQI. We do this using the guidelines and procedures specified in QAP Worksheet 36. So for us, that's going to be the DoD data validation guidelines. Theoretically, those guidelines should be consistent with the DQIs we've assigned to the QC samples and their exceedances. Because when we were assigning the DQI to the QC sample during project planning, we were saying the performance of this QC sample is related to this specific characteristic of data quality. So the performance of the LCS is related to the accuracy of the associated results. Drilling into the specific DQIs, but we're going to focus on precision and accuracy because we don't have all day, right? So precision evaluated by comparing repeat measurements to one another. We're usually calculating RPDs and RSDs. Potential imprecision is indicated when the RPDs or RSDs exceed their acceptance limit, which is our MPC, Worksheet 12. And then we'll talk about the qualifiers on the next slide, but know that UJ is not usually used. Bias is evaluated by comparing a measured amount to a known, we could call it like a non-zero amount, a known amount. And we can call those spikes, even if it's not a true spike, right? High recoveries indicate potential high bias, and low recoveries indicate potential low bias. Contamination/bias is evaluated by comparing a measured amount to the expectation of a non-detect result. As Virginia taught us, that's not zero, right? It's just the expectation that we won't detect. And so those are the blanks. When a blank detection exceeds the worksheet 12 MPC, qualification under the DoD is going to depend on relative amounts detected in the blank and the sample result relative to the LOD. That's why we have kind of complicated tables about it. All right, so we're going to break down some really typical qualification schemes based on DQI and detect/non-detect status of the associated sample result. This is what, if I was training a data validator who was not tied to DOW or to EPA, if I was just training basic concepts, this is really where we would start with our DQIs, right? So as we saw on the last slide, qualifiers associated with precision are J for detections, and then very occasionally UJ for non-detect. As I know it, that's pretty well confined to some field duplicates, and it really kind of depends on your specific project as to whether you're doing that. UJ qualifying non-detects, right? High bias. High bias is indicated by high recoveries. And if there's high bias in the system, the measurement, the result of the associated samples will be higher than their true concentrations. This does assume that the actual system has high bias. So we would assign a J+ qualifier to detected results, and we would not qualify non-detect results due to potential high bias because high bias doesn't present a limitation to the certainty or sensitivity of a non-detect result at the reported LOD. It's not even like non-detectier, right? I know that's not a word. It's okay. All right, low bias, indicated by low recoveries. If there's low bias in the system, the measurement of the associated sample will be lower than the true concentration. So we're assigning a J- qualifier to the detected results. We UJ qualify non-detect results to indicate quantitative uncertainty at the limit of detection because the true LOD may be greater than the reported LOD, right? So we'd have less sensitivity. That's one way to think about it. If recovery is so grossly low that we question whether the lab would even be able to detect a meaningful concentration in our project samples, we would then assign an X qualifier. We're going to recommend rejection because we don't think that they'd be able to see the amount we need them to be able to see. They being the lab. Sorry, labs. All right, then as previously discussed, detections in a blank are a special subset of inaccuracy. So because we have DL, LOD, and LOQ, dealing with blank detections can be a little bit tricky, as we were talking about in the comments earlier. Detected sample results might be U qualified at the LOD, J+ qualified, or not qualified at all. And so now that, and non-detect, we don't qualify those based on blanks. I'm going to take a quick sip of water. Okay. Slow it down. So now that we've defined DQIs, we've defined their role in project planning and in data validation, and their relationship to general qualification schemes, we're going to touch on some key considerations when examining a qualification scheme that we get the feeling might not be appropriate for our project. So when I am evaluating a qualification scheme from a guidance document, these are the considerations I find most helpful for making a decision about deviation. Your mileage may vary, but I just want to demonstrate sort of a systematic approach that we can use. And I think this is a good starting place. So first, does the qualification scheme align with the DQI? The answer is usually going to be no, because misalignment with DQIs is what caused most chemists and validators to start questioning validation schemes. Even if we don't say it in exactly those words, that's when we start to see people going, well, why would we do that, right? Second, can we ascertain the logic behind the qualification scheme as it was written? So a committee of very learned people agreed that this is a logical qualification scheme. So we really should try to understand it before we deviate. To do this, we can read guidelines and policy documents. You can tell that is a hobby of mine. We can also write into DNICs. They may offer an explanation. They might also say something like, "This matter is under consideration." We can also consult our professional networks. Somebody that you know might have a good insight. So next, what is our project's tolerance for error? We're going to start bringing it into the specific context of our project. So especially when we consider the alternative explanations for the qualification scheme, we should then be examining our DQOs, worksheet 11, and thinking about the risks and the consequences of false positives and false negatives for our project. So after making these considerations, we should be able to clearly state why a qualification scheme goes against our professional judgment, if it does, and why we feel it's appropriate to do something else, if we do. So we can then synthesize a more appropriate qualification scheme for our project, considering the factors above. Okay, now what at least I think is the fun part. We are going to examine 3 different qualification schemes that appear in the DoD data validation guidelines. I have selected examples that don't conform to the typical DQI-driven qualification schemes from the previous slide. For each example, we'll talk about the expectation that we might have based on the DQI versus the reality, the qualification scheme as it appears in the guideline. And then we'll walk through these professional judgment considerations. I'm going to drink a bunch more water. One sec. All right. 40 minutes is a long time. Okay, our first example is LCS recovery exceedance in organic data. This qualification scheme appears in DoD Data Validation Guidelines Module 1, Revision 1, GCMS, Module 4, GC, and Module 6, PFAS by 1633 compliant with QSM Table B24. Our DQI for LCSs is accuracy. That is per the UFP QAP manual and the QA/QC compendium, and also our logic, right? It's a known amount. We're looking for recoveries. So expectation versus reality. With high recovery, we expect to J+ qualify a detection and apply no qualifier to a non-detect result. With low recovery, we expect a J- qualifier for a detection and a UJ qualifier for a non-detect result, with X reserved for gross exceedances. Reality. The actual qualification scheme in those guidelines is aligned with our expectations until we get to low recovery. The guideline instructs us to X qualify all non-detect results associated with any low LCS recovery, even if that exceedance is marginal. And that means we're ultimately recommending rejection of those results, right? Regardless of the magnitude of the exceedance. So here we are with our professional judgment considerations. I just stated our potential misalignment with the DQI, X qualifying for any potential low bias. All right, so the logic behind this scheme. Why is this the case? Well, I didn't write the guideline. I wasn't in the room when it was discussed. I have done a lot of questioning and a lot of listening, so let's call this informed speculation. Perhaps the authors feel that because the LCS is an ideal analytical matrix, even a minor low bias in an ideal matrix represents a risk of a much larger low bias in actual sample matrices. So, okay, project tolerance for error. If my project action limit is close to the LOQ, I might really appreciate this guideline exactly how it's written and want to follow it. Trying to move away from PFAS just to give us a little break. So for example, if I'm dealing with TCE and daughters in groundwater, where vapor intrusion is driving residential risk. Depending on my regulatory, ecosystem, some of those compounds may have very, very low action limits. And in that case, I really don't want low bias because it could lead to false non-detect results. And that would obscure risk to human health. So the risk of impactful false negatives is high, impactful because my PAL is so close to my LOQ, and my tolerance is low because I really like human health, right? And in that case, yeah, we're going to follow that guideline and I'm going to double check that everyone did so. But When there's a lot of daylight between the LOQ and the action limit, I think it can be reasonable, based on professional judgment, to decide that low LCS recoveries are maybe not that serious, or at least not serious enough to result in X qualification, right? So in that case, it might make sense to select a gross exceedance level and UJ qualify the non-detect results unless the low recovery is at or below that gross exceedance limit. So if you, listening today, happen to be deviating from this qualification scheme and not explicitly stating anywhere that you're doing so, I don't think your professional judgment is wrong. But we do need to acknowledge in writing when our professional judgment overrules the guidelines we've written into worksheet 36 of the UFP QAP. And at the end of these 3 examples, we'll talk about where that requirement comes from and ways to strike that balance. On to example 2. All right, this next example is a CCV recovery exceedance in organic data. So the qualification scheme appears in the same modules as the previous example, 1, 4, 6. Our DQI for CCVs is accuracy, and that's per the UFP QAP manual and the QA/QC compendium. We have the same expectation as the previous slide because our DQI is still accuracy, and in this case, I've tied my expectation to the DQI. The actual guideline is again largely aligned with our expectations, except the guideline instructs us to UJ qualify all non-detect results, regardless of whether recovery was high or low. So now we're applying a qualifier to non-detect results due to potential high analytical bias, which might not make sense if we have an accuracy DQI. All right, so that's our misalignment with the DQI. Logic. Again, this is informed speculation. It's possible that the author of the guideline viewed the CCV as being associated with a different DQI, or more than one DQI. Perhaps they felt that a CCV recovery exceedance could be evidence of unbiased high variability. And I would say that high variability without directional bias sure sounds like imprecision, which is covered by other QC samples and still doesn't align with that qualification scheme. I will note that the comment draft of that new Module 6 that came out that we all got to look at did not include this scheme. So maybe it truly is under consideration. But right now, it's the qualification scheme for all of the current organics modules. And if I, as a project chemist or data validator, consider the CCV to be an indicator of accuracy, I might worry that UJ qualifying non-detect results due to potential high analytical bias could negatively impact my project team's ability to clearly understand data limitations and make informed project decisions. Usually when we're looking at UJs, we're looking at low bias. If we start mixing in some that were put in there for high bias, and I don't even know how is that a limitation, it might really muddy the waters. And if somebody's not looking at the validation report, they've just got the final data. And yes, we should all look at the validation report. We should. But if someone's not, they might assume they've got a lot of low bias when it's maybe the opposite. So if I'm that chemist with that concern, I might choose a more traditional DQI-driven qualification scheme related to accuracy. And after we review the next example, I'll talk about what I would do if I was the project chemist or data validator in this situation. All right. Our last example is, again, a CCV recovery exceedance, but this time in metals data. This qualification scheme appears in DoD Data Validation Guideline Module 2, ICP OES, and Module 5, ICP MS. Again, our DQI for CCVs is accuracy, and that's per our UFP QAP manual and the QA/QC compendium. And as before, we know our expected qualification scheme for accuracy. The reality, the actual qualification scheme isn't at all aligned with the expectation. The guidelines instruct us to X qualify all results, and that's detected and non-detect, associated with any CCV recovery exceedance. So at first glance, that doesn't seem to align with our DQI at all, right? Well, what happened here? As always, I cannot quote anyone, but I suspect the idea is that metals instruments are calibrated much more frequently than organics instruments, and they're capable of achieving much tighter recoveries. That's why we have a 90 to 110% window for our recovery criteria. And in that case, a CCV exceedance in a metals instrument is a much more significant event than in an organics instrument. It's much more likely to be evidence that there's a systemic out of control condition, right? So when I start looking at my project DQOs, this one's going to be harder for me to parse, but that's because I'm an organics gal. So from a DQI perspective, the qualification scheme doesn't make a lot of sense. But then from my experience, I've actually validated a ton of metals data. I've maybe never run metals instrumentation, but I've been doing this long enough. I've looked at a lot of raw metals data. And I've rarely seen just one CCV exceedance for metals data when I get to see the whole run. When I see them, it's usually kind of a spotty pattern. And that does seem to support the idea that they correspond with a system that's out of control. But how out of control? And does that really render my detected results unusable? What if the results align with 10 years of LTM data? Or what if it's just the one CCV, right? And I can see so much data and it's just this one CCV. I can see everything before it and after it. Well, let's say I consult with a metals-focused QC chemist who's not an organics gal, and we together examine the DQOs, PALs, PQLs, LOQs of our project, and we decide that the accuracy-based qualification scheme is more appropriate unless there's a gross recovery exceedance. We could borrow maybe 60% because that's for the LCS, and that's pretty high for a gross recovery exceedance, or unless there's a pattern of exceedances that does indicate instability in the system. Let's say I decided to do that. How do I go about doing that? Do I just like do it my way and assume people will either agree or maybe not notice? Because I mean, like, who reads validation reports anyway, right? That's a joke. Please read your validation reports. All right. So let's say there's at least one qualification scheme we deemed inappropriate or suboptimal for our projects. Are we officially allowed to deviate from the DoD guidelines? Officially. So I would love for everyone to use those reaction buttons. Give me a heart if you think the answer is yes. We're allowed to deviate even when the guidelines tell us to X qualify a result. Oh, I love you too. All right, give me some applause if you think the answer is no. We can't deviate from a qualification scheme, especially if it says to X qualify. Oh, thank you, thank you. You're too kind. All right, so jokes aside, the answer is yeah, we could probably deviate, but we're going to need to do so with a lot of care. So the general data validation guidelines tell us that professional judgment is required, right? They say that over and over. And then they also tell us that the guidelines don't replace professional judgment. The exact quote is written on the slide. But the guidelines also state that deviations from any validation procedure while planning or executing project activities should be documented. So the general assumption or requirement is that we will follow the DoD data validation guidelines for our project. It is also written into most of our contracts for my fellow contractors out there. So when our professional judgment leads us to believe another path is more prudent, we need to document this decision. And also, that's just part of science. We're supposed to write everything down, right? So now we're going to talk about some practical steps we can take when we are planning to deviate from the DoD data validation guidelines and how these can vary based on the stage of project planning or execution. All right, we're going to start with the ideal scenario. My favorite scenario, makes me smile all day long. Documenting planned deviations during project planning, which is to say, during UFP QAC development. So if I know that I'm going to deviate from one of the guidelines, First, I'm going to discuss it with my project team, and I'm going to get approval from my PM upfront, because they're the ones who are going to be receiving comments regarding what I write in those worksheets. And I really don't want them to be surprised if my actions result in some comments. A good rule of thumb for people who are earlier in their careers is just never surprise your PM. All right, quick water break. Okay, so next I need to document the planned deviation. I'm going to do that in worksheet 36 of the UFP QAP, because that's where we describe the data validation procedure. I always include a paragraph specifying the DoD data validation guidelines relevant to this work anyway, so I'll just follow up with a statement about the deviations, only I might call them exceptions, to the qualification schemes in these guidelines. I specify the QC sample, the exceedance type, and then state the qualification scheme that will be used for the project. Lastly, I inform the data validators. Yeah, they really should read the UFP QAP. We all should. Just like the validation reports, they're just beautiful. But we should also do everyone a favor and call their attention to it. I let them know about it in advance, especially if I'm subcontracting them, and I remind them when I submit the data for validation. I said this was the ideal scenario. That's because it results in upfront concurrence by all UFP QAP signatories, including the client and the regulator. Now, you may get some comments, right? But it is better to resolve those during the planning stage than at any other time, because once you do, per the general DoD data validation guidelines, the validation requirements in a project-specific QAP supersede the guidance documents. So ultimately, documenting deviations during the project planning stage really should significantly limit costly rework. But what happens if you're the data validator and you're faced with a qualification scheme that goes against your professional judgment? Well, whether or not validators can deviate from the DoD data validation guidelines as written is kind of complicated, especially if the validation is occurring under subcontract. Hey, I contracted you to follow that guideline. The validation guidelines do explicitly encourage professional judgment, but mostly when encountering situations not specified in the guidelines. There are specific times when the guidelines will say, if it's not A, B, or C as listed above, then use your professional judgment, right? Which tells us that they assume that we're not just going to give validators permission to unilaterally deviate from published qualification schemes. So I would say always check worksheet 36 of the QAP first. I mean, we should always do that first anyway, but there might be a statement about the allowable extent of professional judgment or how to document deviations from the guidelines. How close am I to time? Oh, I'm doing okay. So if the QAP contains relevant instructions or specs, of course follow those because we all know they supersede the guidelines. But otherwise, if that's not in there, whoops, no one saved you, and you're the validator and you feel the need to deviate from the guidelines based on professional judgment, you will need all the support you can get. So if you find yourself in this situation, I suggest first discussing the issue with the project chemist and or your validation supervisor, because they should be able to help you with some next steps. So if they agree with your logic and your proposed approach, thoroughly document it in the data validation report. Write down what the guideline said and why it's not the best path forward and what you're doing instead. Doing this really could prevent rework, assuming that readers agree with your logic. And if they don't, then at the very least, it will give you some context to fall back on when several months from now, maybe a year from now, you have forgotten all about that SDG and all about this project, and you suddenly get this call to explain yourself. I hope I'm not the only one that's ever happened to. So finally, if no one's done it yet, someone needs to alert the project team to the situation and check worksheet 6 for that communication pathway. Again, you want to gather support where you can because you might get opposition from a future reviewer, especially on the regulator side of things. And also you just don't want your PM to be surprised. You just don't. It never ends well. All right, we're almost done, I promise. Okay. If data validation has been completed before you, as a project chemist, realize that a qualification scheme was not appropriate for your project. Oh, I'm so sorry, friend. So, I'm not talking about dispositioning X qualifiers. This is about what to do if you review the validation reports and realize that you disagree with a qualification scheme to the extent that you now feel it really shouldn't have been used for the project. This is a tricky, hairy, icky situation, and it's by far the most effort-intensive time to start dealing with this issue. It's my understanding, and Melinda can absolutely correct me if I'm wrong, and I hope she will. So it's my understanding that the project team has the right to select final qualifiers for all results, not just X qualifiers. But the amount of rework involved in reassigning qualifiers after validation is potentially very high, and it probably should be, right? So by this point, you're going to be dealing with the data usability assessment, or the DUA process. The structure and procedure of that are going to be described in worksheet 37 of your QAP, and we're going to learn so much more about that in a few minutes. You will need to assemble the DUA team, which by design is going to be a diverse group of mostly non-chemists. So now try to keep them awake while you make an impassioned argument for your approach to the selection of final qualifiers for non-detect results associated with high CCV recoveries. So then, assuming they're awake and assuming they concur, the real work begins. So next, you would need to determine the appropriate final qualifier for the results impacted by the deviation. If this was that CCV example, you couldn't just throw away all the UJs. During validation, there could have been a bunch of QC exceedances, and the validator had to pick the final qualifier and the final reason code if you're using them, and they might have dropped everything else. You'll need to check the validation reports to determine the next most appropriate and impactful qualifier, like for each result. After that, you get to document everything, the DUA meetings, the original and final qualifiers, the logic behind the changes. Regulators are going to be wary of project teams making changes to validation qualifiers other than X, because validation is an independent QC check. So your documentation is going to need to be thorough and airtight and reproducible, and they have to be able to back check it. I guess that's reproducible. Worth saying twice, I guess. So lastly, you're going to have to circle back with the data management and reporting teams and make sure qualifiers and reason codes are updated in your database and any client and or regulatory databases. Figures, tables, and report conclusions may all need to be updated. So hopefully it's clear why waiting until the DUA to document any deviations from the guidelines is by far your least preferred option. Oh my goodness, you guys, we did it. We're at the conclusion slide. All right. So, in conclusion, when we're examining qualification schemes from the DV guidelines, I think we should be considering the DQI associated with the measurement, alternative explanations of the published scheme, our project's DQOs and our tolerance for false positives and negatives. And then if we still want to deviate or feel the need to deviate from the qualification scheme in the guideline, we should remember that documentation is required regardless of the stage of planning or execution. The earlier we document these decisions, the better. Aim for that project planning stage, please. And then develop broad concurrence as early as possible. Get that buy-in, right? So overall, I really want to encourage us all to exercise a well-documented, systems-focused approach when we're weighing professional judgment against any qualification scheme to ensure robust and defensible data sets. I demonstrated one approach, but I'm sure there are a lot more out there. So I hope that this will spark a discussion. Oh, I've talked for too long. All right, thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Capri. That was a great presentation. Checking the Q&A, it doesn't seem like we have anything right now. Again, if you have put your question in, I have it raised. Whoever raised their hand would want to, if they had a question, you can type it in the Q&A. We can answer that for you. We have a couple minutes remaining. Or you can put it in chat. It's fine.
A perfect presentation. No notes, right? I'm just kidding. Okay, I'll mute myself.
As a sign, we don't have any more questions. And for the interest of everyone's time, we'll keep moving ahead.